I apologize deeply for not following up with this story. There have been some deeply troubling events following my last post which prevented me from continuing. It's only now that I feel like I'm able to relive what happened. I believe I left off with the night I found that the power had gone out and I'd broken 2 more of the rules. I hadn't realized the clock was wrong, nor had I intended for that light in the basement to go out, but something else had. During the next few weeks, the general atmosphere in my home shifted. My wife seemed more irritable and I found myself getting furious over the smallest things. I vividly recall dropping a piece of toast on the floor and being so upset about it that I stomped it into the ground and thought about burning the whole house down. I remember reading once, perhaps even on Reddit, about a phenomenon known as the call of the void. Nearly every person has experienced it sometime in their life. It's that thought you get when driving into work and you think, just for a moment, that you could drive straight on into traffic. It's the feeling of standing on the top of a building and having the urge to jump for no reason. It's when you're alone with a person whom you love more than anything, like your wife or newborn child, and you have the sudden, vivid imagery of wrapping your hands around their necks and squeezing the life out of them. It's supposed to be your brain running a sort of systems check. Experts suggest that your brain is just affirming its survival instinct, making sure that you wouldn't actually do something that would end or severely damage your life. Except, they're not supposed to happen every day, let alone several times a day, like I've seemed to have them. These thoughts just slip into my head for no reason at all. I could burn the house down. I could kill my family. I could slice my wrists open and watch the blood slip down my fingertips until the world goes black forever. Just as quickly as they came, the thoughts were gone. This went on for several weeks before I finally brought it up to my wife. I told her I kept having these dark thoughts slipping into my head without any reason. She told me she'd been having that happen too, especially when she was alone. We promised each other to try hard to get those thoughts out of our heads and that if we couldn't stop having such dark impulses, we'd go see a therapist. That night I awoke to the cries of my baby. With bleary eyes, I got up and walked over the bassinet in the corner where he slept. I bent over to pick him up. My hands found nothing but blankets wadded in the corner. My son wasn't in his bed. Suddenly awake now, I realized the crying wasn't coming from the room at all, but from somewhere else in the house. I left the bedroom and followed the cries immediately, knowing already where I'd find my baby but not wanting to believe it. As soon as I opened the door to the basement, the wails grew louder and more aggressive. I flew down the stairs, nearly stumbling on the last step, and the crying suddenly stopped. The basement was completely empty. I searched for my son in every corner but found nothing but silence and emptiness. It probably took about a minute, maybe less, to determine that the basement was empty, but it felt like much longer. I was about to give up when I heard the basement door slam and the light bulb pop. I was plunged into darkness in the basement and my mind suddenly flashed to the letter. I saw it with such vividness in my mind that it was like I had it in front of me. 2. Always leave one light on in the basement. 3. If you misplace anything, do not look for it. I groped around in the dark for the wall and followed it to the staircase. My eyes were adjusted slightly then, but still not well enough. I crawled up the staircase on shaky limbs until I felt the door with my knuckles. I reached up and twisted the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I stood up and twisted harder, feeling it give a little and remembering that this door didn't actually have a lock on it, which meant that the only way the knob wouldn't twist would be if someone on the other side was holding it closed. I twisted harder and pushed at the door with my shoulder, feeling it give a little more, but not nearly enough to give me hope. I felt the darkness on my skin, as if it were somehow alive, and my crawled as it tightened into goosebumps. I pushed harder, yelling desperately as I heard the bottom step creak. I froze. The next step up creaked. Then the next. I pounded at the door pleading for my wife to hear, and I listened to the creaks of each step draw nearer. There was a single step between where I stood and the sound I'd been hearing, and I was just about to turn around when suddenly the door opened and I fell out. All at once the light in the basement popped on and I stared up at the face of my wife. "What's going on?" she asked. I saw her eyes were red and bloodshot and the baby in her arms was crying. I scrambled to my feet and asked where she'd found him. She looked perplexed. "He was in his bassinet. I woke up 'cause I heard you banging on the door." "What's going on?" I didn't want to scare her, so I told her I thought I'd been sleepwalking. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, but lay in bed staring at the time on the alarm clock. When I got back to bed, it was 3:57. In the days that followed, things got worse. My wife started having night terrors. She started talking and crying and even screaming in her sleep. I can wake her up sometimes, but about half the time I just have to ride it out with her. Nights like those are the worst. She screams and kicks and cries, and no matter how hard I try, she won't wake up. At first, I could understand what she was saying, but now it's all gibberish. She used to say stuff like, "No. No. He's our son. And no," or "Please. Don't. Please." But now, she says half words and stuff that sounds like nonsense. Most commonly she would say, "ASEDR," but other times it was stuff like, "PAORS." She would just repeat these things over and over in her sleep as she cried and kicked and screamed, and I was left to helplessly watch and try to soothe the baby. Every morning she woke up without any memory of the night before. She didn't remember having any bad dreams or anything. Even on the nights where I could wake her up, she still didn't remember anything. She would just look up at me with wide eyes in the darkness and ask why I was shaking her. I suggested she go to a therapist after about a week of this. She agreed with the condition that I went with her, which I was more than happy to oblige. We found a sleep specialist downtown and scheduled an appointment for that weekend. We went together with the baby and sat in the stuffy waiting room while rocks grew in my stomach. For some reason I couldn't understand, I was nervous. We told the therapist what was going on and that she'd been speaking nonsense in her sleep. He was a thin man with long bony fingers which he pressed against his lips as we told our story. When we were finished, he calmly told us his assessment. "I don't think you need a professional to tell you that this has something to do with your subconscious. Something in your mind is not being expressed outwardly, so when you sleep, it's able to come out in the form of these night terrors." He suggested hypnotism. I laughed out loud at this. There's a lot I can believe in, but hypnotism is a stretch even for my belief system. I looked up at my wife, whom I expected to have the same expression of bewildered doubt, but instead her expression was wooden. She agreed. The therapist asked for absolute silence. He said that if the baby starts to fuss, I would have to take him out. He said this only may work if the conditions are perfect. I expected him to pull out a pocket watch like they do on television, or maybe a ballpoint pen to swing back and forth, but instead he told her to sit up in the couch with her hands on her knees and her palms facing upward, and close her eyes. He talked to her in a low, focused voice and began to paint pictures of a meadow, then an ocean, and so on. It took about 15 minutes before I realized that my wife was completely relaxed. Her chin rested against her chest and her shoulders hung on her like wet laundry. He asked her to say her name. She did. He asked her to tell him where she was. She said the attic. He asked which attic. She said in our house. I frowned. She'd never been up in the attic and I wasn't honestly sure where the entrance was. He asked why she was there. She said that's where the stairs were. He asked what stairs. She said the ones in the ceiling in the hallway. He asked her what she was doing. She said she was hiding. Hiding from what? Hiding from Manada. Who is Manada? It was at this point that my wife began to scream. The car ride home was unusually quiet. She didn't remember anything she said, and I was too afraid to dive into questions. I stayed up late that night after she went to bed. I sat on the couch, sipping from a glass of Jim Beam whiskey and staring at the space between me and the television. My mind was racing, and no matter how many glasses of whiskey I drank, I couldn't help the feeling that I needed to check something out. I needed to find the attic, or at least, I needed to make sure there were no stairs in the hallway. I've done my own fair amount of home improvement projects, and I knew that although it was unlikely, it was possible to cover up an attic entrance with a fair amount of plaster and paint. With the top of the broom handle, I started at the end of the hallway where the baby's room was and began to thump against the ceiling. I thumped hard against the ceiling, listening to the hollow sound on the other end, and was about to give up and put the broom away and laugh at myself for being so silly, when at the other end of the hallway, I heard a solid thump. I hit again around the sound and found a space about 3 feet wide and 3 feet long where there was no hollow sound. I pushed against this square and saw, very faintly, that as I pushed, the square flexed against the paint. I don't know that I would have done so if I were sober, but I retrieved a chair from the kitchen and put it up where the hollow sound was. I groped around for the seam, then with my pocket knife, I began to slit the paint apart. As I cut the last bit of paint and plaster with my knife, I saw wood begin to sag. I slipped my fingers onto the lip I'd made and pulled the wood down. With little effort on my part, the entrance to the attic plopped down, knocking me off my chair and revealing a set of stairs leading to the attic. I sat up, ignoring the pain in my head and elbow, perplexed with what I'd just discovered. I pulled my phone out and flicked on the flashlight and stepped up onto the first step. The wood creaked, but seemed like it would hold. I stepped up, not planning on crawling into the attic, but just intending to look. It was dusty and covered in insulation, but at the end, just beyond my reach, was a large cardboard box. I stepped up further, placing my knee on the floor of the attic and extended my hand until I could get the box. It was surprisingly heavy, and as I pulled the box close, it caught a corner and tipped over, spilling its contents across the attic floor. My mouth went dry as I saw what was in the box, and I was filled with a sudden, overwhelming sense of unease. The box was filled to the brim with old Polaroid photos of infant children.